Thanks so much, Gordon. Well, it's great to be with you on this beautiful spring morning, and hopefully some more folks will be joining us around 11:30. I want to talk to you this morning about the economy. I think we all know the economy has changed in some profound, basic way over the last 4 or 5 years. But it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around it sometimes. What I want to do is take us on a little journey to a big picture view of the economy. Because I'm going to argue that it's only when we take this kind of big picture view of the economy, looking at it from a historical point of view, and from a point of view that takes into account more than just dollars and investments, but looks at the economy in a holistic way. It's only when we do this that we can actually understand what's been going on these past few years. So I want to start by looking at the history of GDP. Now, GDP is how we measure how the economy is doing. It's gross domestic product. It's the total amount of money flowing through the economy on an annual basis. And as you can see, for the last few thousand years, GDP basically was pretty much flat at a fairly low level. And then just in the last century, it's gone through the ceiling. So that right there tells us we've been living in a very unusual period in world history. Absolutely unique. There's never been anything like it before. Of course, population has also grown dramatically during this period. Now, this is GDP per capita, right? So we have to look at that and then multiply it by the increasing number of capitas, right? There are 7.1 billion people in the world today. There were fewer than half that number when I was born in 1950, right? So this is also unique in world history. We've never seen population growth on this scale and at this speed. Another thing that's unique about our time is energy consumption. And I'm going to suggest that this is really at the heart of these other two big trends of economic growth and population. Why so? Because energy is fundamental. It takes energy to do everything we do. Without energy, nothing happens. So something has been going on with energy in the last 100, 200 years that is also absolutely unique in human history. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But before I do that, I should mention this book, which is really why I'm talking to you at all right now. I read this book, The Limits to Growth, when I was 21 years old in 1972 when it was first published, and it changed my life. I realized for the first time in my young existence at that time that this time we're living in is unique, and that it may be bumping up against this experience of growth that we've all come to take for granted, may be bumping up against some fundamental barriers. And not, centuries from now, but, well, basically right about now. This is the Limits to Growth study, just to refresh your memory. I'm sure you all heard of it back when it was published. It was the first attempt to use computers to model the interactions between economic growth, pollution, and depletion of resources. So all of the values for these things were fed into a computer program, and this was the standard run scenario that came out. And it showed a peak and decline in world industrial output sometime in the first few decades of the 21st century. Now this, of course, was a very unwelcome result, and the authors of this study, when they published it, were immediately bombarded by all sorts of criticisms. This wasn't an attempt to forecast the future. It was a modeling exercise. It was an attempt to say, well, if trends continue as they are, then these are some things that could happen. Well, what actually has happened in the last 40 years? Well, it seems as though we're very much on the track that they were describing. The CSIRO, that's the Commonwealth Industrial Research Organization, or Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization. It's the main scientific research organization for the nation of Australia. And they went back in 2008 and did a retrospective study of limits to growth to see how it was holding up. And their conclusion was that it's actually holding up pretty well. We're basically right on track for, for that industrial peak and decline sometime in the next few decades. And in fact, I would suggest that we're seeing the beginnings of that right now. So that's a fairly big picture view that I've just given you of what's going on, but I want to now unpack that in a little bit more detail, starting with energy. I want to talk about debt. We hear a lot about debt these days, and climate. And I want to suggest to you that these are the three main drivers for the economic change that's occurring in the world right now. So let's start with energy. What's going on with energy? Well, as recently as 100, 200 years ago, this was the dominant form of energy in the United States, firewood, right? And we got things done largely through muscle power. Now, of course, in the late 19th century, steam power was coming on, and we were burning more and more coal. Coal didn't overtake firewood as our main energy source until the mid-1880s in this country. A little bit before that in Britain, but for the United States, it wasn't that long ago, actually. Well, firewood was a limited source of energy because trees could only grow back so fast. When we found fossil fuels, it seemed as though we had discovered an energy bonanza. Not only were coal and oil more energy dense than wood, it took a smaller amount to produce more energy, but also these fossil fuels were extremely cheap to extract and very versatile to use. Imagine running your car on firewood. It could be done. It's theoretically possible, but of course, you know, every 50 miles or maybe 20 miles, you'd have to stop and fill up your car with another bundle of wood, and it would be very impractical. Oil is the most concentrated and energy-dense fuel that we've ever found, and in the early days, it was extraordinarily cheap. Nature had done all the work for us. You know, over the course of tens of millions of years, geological processes had heated and compressed this biological material from ancient times into a form that was just magic. I mean, think about the last time you ran out of gas in your car and had to push your car off to the side of the road. How much work was that? You know, it's not easy. Well, imagine pushing your car for, let's say, 30 miles. Think of how much work that would be. It would be weeks of hard, back-breaking labor. But we get that done for us with a single gallon of gasoline, for which we're paying $4 and complaining. Imagine if you could get weeks and by some calculations, maybe eight or more weeks of hard labor for $4? Well, that's why we've mechanized every process of production and transport that we possibly could during the last 100 years. When we talk about increases in labor productivity, typically we're not talking about people working longer hours or working harder with their muscles. We're talking about people using more machines to do more work. Okay, so oil and other fossil fuels have given us enormous economic benefits, but of course they are finite too, just as the forests are finite. In a way, fossil fuels are even more finite because the forests, if you stop cutting them, will eventually regrow. But oil is not being formed in any economically significant quantities right now. Once we use it all, it's basically gone for good as far as we or our civilization are concerned. So it's a finite resource. How important is that? Well, it turns out that it is quite important. Here in the United States, we saw the beginnings of the oil industry back in the late 1850s, the first commercial oil well in Pennsylvania. For decades, the United States was the world's foremost, not only oil producing nation, but the world's foremost oil exporting nation. During World War II, 7 out of 8 barrels of oil burned by the Allies came from oil wells in Texas and Oklahoma, Southern California. So we've had more experience with oil in this country than any place else in the world. And part of our experience is we know what it's like to run out. Well, not run out completely. The U.S. is still producing oil and will still be producing oil decades from now, but not like we were in the old days, the Beverly Hillbillies days of the 1960s and early 1970s. At that time, the U.S. was producing over 10 million barrels a day of oil. But discoveries of oil, these vertical green bars, discoveries of oil in the U.S. have been declining since the early 1930s. So we're just not finding oil the way we were. And production of oil in the U.S. hit a peak around 1970 and has generally been declining since then. Of course, discoveries in Alaska made a big difference in the 1970s and early 80s. Then there was the Gulf of Mexico, and now we're working on North Dakota. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. For the world as a whole, discoveries have been declining since the early 1960s. So it's clear that the oil industry is changing, and it's changing very rapidly. World oil production, very often official agencies lump in all kinds of liquid fuels together with oil, so it's hard to tell what's going on. They'll lump in biofuels and natural gas liquids like butane and propane, which we don't use for transportation, refinery gains and all these other things. But if you extract all of those other categories and just look at regular crude oil, the world is producing about the same amount today as it was in 2005. Now that's strange because up until 2005, world oil production had been inexorably growing year after year after year by about 3% per year. So what's happened since 2005? Is it just that people don't want oil anymore? Well, if that were the case, why would we be paying $100 a barrel or $4 a gallon for gasoline? If we had plenty, the price should be lower, right? Well, in fact, there's plenty of demand for oil, especially in places like China. You know, the Chinese are buying 16 million cars a year right now. The American car market currently is about 15 million cars a year. So the Chinese car market is bigger than the US car market. So Chinese demand for oil is exploding. China's oil imports right now are running at a faster pace than US oil imports. And that's remarkable. I mean, for many, many years, the U.S. has been the world's foremost oil importing nation. There are other ways in which the oil business has changed. This is what it used to look like back in the old days. This is what it looks like today. We have to search for oil in very inconvenient places, like in ultra-deep water, under miles of ocean water, or with the tar sands of Alberta, Canada, where what we're doing is basically a mining operation, mining bitumen, this sticky, gooey stuff that then has to be refined into oil using enormous amounts of energy. This is the relationship between oil prices and the economy. Now, the squiggly line, of course, is the oil price adjusted for inflation. These are 2008 dollars. And the vertical gray bars are recessions going back to 1970. Every time we've had an oil price spike, we've had a recession. Very close relationship there. Well, what happened in 2008? We had the biggest oil price spike in history, up to $150 a barrel. And very soon the economy went into a tailspin. Of course, that's not the only reason the economy faltered in 2008. Of course, we had a housing bubble that burst. But the trigger for that crisis was, in many respects, the price of oil. Why so? Well, where did the housing crisis really hit first? It was in the far distant suburbs. House prices had been bid up and up and up, so people were moving further and further out into more and more distant suburbs. So they had to commute longer and longer distances, right? And when the price of oil went up, the price of gasoline went up, that made commuting more and more expensive. People often found themselves in a situation where they couldn't afford both to pay their mortgage and to pay the gasoline bill on their credit card. So part of what we're seeing right now is persistent high oil prices. Now, with oil price spikes in the past, these have been transitory, and the price of oil has gone back down again. Now, yes, the price of oil is not where it was in 2008. It was up to $150. But right now, on the international market, oil is selling for about $110 a barrel. That's about 4 times what it was 10 years ago in inflation-adjusted terms. So that's a huge drag on economic activity for the world as a whole, and particularly for the older industrialized countries like the United States and Europe. Now, why is oil so expensive? Is it because there are speculators on Wall Street who are, driving up the prices? Well, if that were the case, it would be an easy fix. But unfortunately, it's not so simple. It's just gotten more expensive to explore for and produce oil. Remember the slide of the big Deepwater Horizon oil rig? Well, it can cost up to $500 million to drill an exploratory well in ultra-deep water. And so unless the oil price is up around $100 a barrel, it's just not cost effective for the industry to go out and look for new sources. Meanwhile, when oil prices are that high, they're a drag on the economy. So it's a situation where something has to give. Now, we are having a little more luck looking for oil in this country these days. You've probably read about oil production in the Bakken field in North Dakota. There's also the Eagle Ford play in South Texas. We're applying new technology, hydrofracturing or fracking, to produce oil from tight reservoirs. These are reservoirs that geologists have known about for a long time, but they wouldn't drill them because you'd send a drill bit down and basically you'd get a little plume of production from the rock right around the well bore, and that was it. Because the rock was just so impermeable. It was not porous, so it didn't allow the oil or natural gas to migrate to the well bore. Well, now with hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling, there's technology to access more of that oil, but it's expensive technology. Again, unless oil prices are up in the range of $100 a barrel, it doesn't really pay to go looking for this stuff. But there are other problems with hydrofracturing. Even though we have this fancy new technology, the rock itself hasn't changed. So it requires very high rates of drilling. Each well has a very high, I'll get back to these in just a moment, very high decline rate. You drill a well in January, and by December, the rate of production from that well has already fallen by maybe 60, 70%. So in order to keep production flat from a large field of wells, or to increase production, that means you have to drill and drill and drill. So far, the oil and gas industry has drilled something like 60,000 wells in the United States just in the last few years. Let's go back to this slide, because it tells the story. Even though U.S. oil production has only ticked up a little bit, drilling has increased dramatically. So if we want this current little spate of increased oil production to continue, that means we're going to have to drill a lot more in the years ahead. I have this website up here because this is my organization, Post Carbon Institute, has just produced a report on shale gas and tight oil, and you can access that report on this website. It's a free PDF download, and it's the most thorough analysis of the data on shale gas and tight oil that has been done to date, including work by the U.S. Department of Energy and the International Energy Agency. We looked at 63,000 wells and looked at their initial production rates, their decline rates, and so on. And what we found was that even though there are shale plays in a number of places in the United States, within each play there are only small sweet spots where production can occur profitably. So even though the resource base is very large, and often you'll read or hear about the U.S. having 100 years of cheap natural gas as a result of fracking, or decades of more of high rates of oil production from North Dakota. Well, that's only seemingly true if you take the initial production rates from those sweet spots and extrapolate that to the entire resource base. But our research shows that that's unrealistic. Most of the resource base is going to be uneconomic to produce, or will be produced only very slowly. And again, all of this is going to require very, very high rates of expensive drilling. So don't believe the hype that the United States is in the early phase of an energy bonanza. What we're actually seeing is the last gasp of a desperate industry. Taking into account the number of drilling locations that are possible in the Bakken and the Eagle Ford. This is just tight oil here. This isn't the shale gas. It's a different decline curve in that case. But just for tight oil, we foresee a peak and rapid decline in production around 2017. So not many years from now for the United States. I don't know how well you can see this back there. This is the Barnett Play in central Texas. It's right around Fort Worth, Texas. Actually, you can see the town of Fort Worth, Texas, right there on the map, and hundreds and hundreds of shale gas, mostly gas wells, right around Fort Worth. The black dots are the sweet spots. Those are the places that are producing profitably, and the red dots are shale gas wells that are producing, and they're actually losing money on production with every cubic foot of natural gas that comes out of the ground.
Do you want a pointer?
Oh, no, that's okay. I mean, this has a pointer, but I don't think it's necessary. Yeah, thank you, though. Of course, there are also enormous environmental risks with these new methods of extraction, whether we're talking about tar sands or deep water drilling or hydrofracturing. These are some of the problems with hydrofracturing. Not only problems with water quality, but also air quality. Very large amounts of methane are released into the atmosphere. Methane, of course, is natural gas. A great deal of the methane that is liberated from these fracked wells goes straight into the atmosphere, which has consequences for human health, health of livestock, wildlife, and also for climate. We often hear that natural gas is a bridge fuel to a post-carbon energy economy because it's cleaner burning than coal. Well, that's true, but if you take into account the methane emissions from hydrofracturing, actually natural gas that we produce from fracking is worse for the climate than burning coal. So this is not a very sustainable situation. We have an energy crisis that is emerging all around us in a way that's hard for people to understand because natural gas prices are low, oil prices are high, the US is producing more right now. There are a lot of factors that seemingly are contradictory, but if you put them all in context, it's really clear we're at the end, we're nearing the end of the fossil fuel era. And all of the things I've been describing to you are basically symptoms of that. Now, of course, that's not the only thing that's going on with the economy. It is primary. It's essential to understand the energy picture in order to understand the economy. But there are other things going on. And let's talk about debt for a while. And here again, let's start with the context. How did we get in debt in the first place? Well, there's a story. And the story starts in the early 20th century, when our problem was a problem of overproduction. With cheap fossil fuels, it was possible to make stuff in assembly lines, make stuff faster and in larger quantities than people were accustomed to using or buying. People bought things mostly with cash. But there were big ticket items that were coming online, like automobiles. This is an ad for a 1910 Studebaker. And in 1910, a Studebaker cost $900. Doesn't sound like very much now, but in 1910, that was a lot of money. Not many people had $900 sitting around with which to buy a new automobile. So the automobile industry became also a finance industry, to help people to go into debt so that they could afford to buy automobiles. So over the course of the 20th century, consumer credit expanded dramatically so that people could buy and consume more stuff in order to make the economy grow faster, to enable the economy to grow as fast as it could, given these enormous cheap energy inputs. Well, there is evidence emerging in the field of economics to suggest that what happened during the course of the 20th century was unique and that it was in fact tied to cheap fossil energy. This is a paper by Robert Gordon published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it provoked a lot of discussion among professional economists over the last 6 months or so. Basically, his thesis is that the data show that most of the economic growth in all of world history occurred during the mid-20th century, and that this rapid economic growth was tied largely to cheap oil and electrification. With cheap oil, we had the emergence of the automobile industry. We had road building at a pace we'd never seen before. We had transportation expanding all over the place, the airline industry. And what's trade without transport? In order to expand trade, you have to expand transport. They move in lockstep. At the same time, cities and households, farms were getting electricity for the first time, so people were buying their very first electric and electronic appliances, their first air conditioners and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and so on. All of this unleashed a spate of consumption like nothing ever before seen in world history. Now, Gordon says that after this spate of growth and consumption sort of started to taper off as people already had their first car, people already had their first washing machine and other electric appliances, then another wave of economic growth started in the 1970s, having to do with computers, the internet, cell phones, and so on. So it's also technology driven, but he says the evidence shows that this next wave of economic activity was not nearly as significant as what came before with oil and electrification. So yes, new innovation, new technologies do provoke more economic growth, but not necessarily at the same level or at the level we would like to see. As Gordon suggests, the 1980s were a turning point. Economic growth started to taper off, partly because of stagnation of wages. The financialization of the economy starts in the 1980s. Why? It's because even though economic growth is starting to stagnate, debt is actually starting to increase. What's going on there? Looking at Gordon's data, I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that we tried to keep consumption growing by going into more and more debt. Now, I'm not talking about government debt here. I'm talking about household debt. When did you get your first credit card? Was it the 1980s by any chance? You know, that's when a lot of us got our first credit cards. The credit industry started expanding dramatically in the 1980s and the 1990s. U.S. household debt was expanding at 3 times the rate of GDP, starting during that era. So we were borrowing our way to prosperity. Now this is total U.S. debt. It breaks out government debt, which is the top bit in blue, and then corporate debt, that's financial institutions in yellow, corporate debt in green, and then household debt in the dark blue at the bottom. And as you can see, up until the big crash in 2008, government debt wasn't actually growing any faster than other categories of debt. But in 2008, suddenly something happens. The economy starts to implode upon itself. Massive defaults, the value of real estate plummets. Households in the US lose something like $12 trillion in net worth as a result of declining real estate values. So government steps in as the borrower and spender of last resort in order to keep the economy from collapsing. We have stimulus spending, we have the Federal Reserve stepping in with quantitative easing, enormous amounts of new money being created. Still to this day, the US federal government is deficit spending at a rate of almost $100 billion a month. Essentially, the economy is on life support. And we hear all the talk in Washington about reducing deficit spending. Well, it's clear we can't keep running up government debt to the stratosphere. That's not something that can go on forever. But on the other hand, if US government deficit spending were to go away tomorrow, the economy would collapse. The relationship between deficit spending and GDP is virtually 1-to-1. And so if we take away $1 trillion a year in deficit spending, which is what we're doing right now, that would essentially reduce the US GDP, which is about $14 trillion, by about $1 trillion. There would go all economic growth and then some considerable amount. This is one of my favorite quotes from our previous president, George W. Bush. On September 24th, 2008, he said, if we don't loosen up some money, this sucker could go down. And by this sucker, this was a technical term he was using to describe the US economy. We've been loosening up some money for the last 5 years, enormous amounts. And yet, it's not enough to get the economy growing again. And that's what everyone is talking about. We've got to get this economy growing. Well, what if it's not going to happen? What if we've reached fundamental limits, resource limits, energy limits, and debt limits? What if the economy from this point on is going to look very different? Shouldn't we be thinking differently and acting differently under those circumstances, rather than just hoping that somehow it'll be the 60s all over again? Well, the other thing that's happening with regard to the economy is, of course, climate change. And most people don't think of climate change in terms of the economy, but there's a cost to climate change. Clearly, global emissions are increasing dramatically. Land surface temperature is increasing at the same time. We know that the global average temperature is going to increase by at least 2 degrees over the next few decades. We know that it's already increased about 1 degree, and already we're seeing record droughts, and the North Polar ice cap is disappearing before our very eyes, and we're seeing hurricanes in places that we never seen them before, and all this sort of thing. But it's not going to stop at 2 degrees. With the amount of CO2 we've already put in the atmosphere, we can pretty well expect to see something like 4 degrees. And with high methane emissions, like we're seeing not only from hydrofracturing, but also naturally as the permafrost melts up in the North Polar regions, it releases methane into the atmosphere. And methane over a short period of time is 20 to 100 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So we could very well see by the end of this century 4 to 6 degrees of warming. Well, what does that mean for the economy? If we're already seeing things like Hurricane Sandy and record droughts, what do we have to anticipate over the course of the next few decades? So here we are. We've been on a kind of roller coaster ride or train ride over the last 100 years. Basically, all of us in this room have grown up during this unique historic period that we have tended to think is somehow normal. Just because that's, we've been around for a while and that's how it's been during our lives, right? So it must be normal, right? But if you take a longer historic perspective, there's nothing normal about what's going on in the world today. Nothing at all. But we want it to keep speeding up, right? We want more jobs, we want higher returns on investments, and we've been told that we should expect that. Well, the fact is we live on a finite planet. You can't continue increasing population and consumption forever. Sooner or later, we have to have a hard talk among ourselves about just how much the earth can provide and how much we really need, and come to some kind of a resolution. We have some shocks on the way. economic shocks, environmental shocks, resource shocks. So that suggests we should be building more resilience in society. Rather than trying to get this machine going again and getting it to go as fast as we can, we should be making this machine as resilient as possible. That means having more redundancy in systems rather than, having all of our stuff made in China. Why not make some of our stuff here and various different places so that the whole system has more leeway to it? These are the characteristics of resilient systems. Redundancy in critical points, dispersed system control points, dispersed inventories, balancing feedback loops. Now these are exactly the kinds of things that we've been trying to eliminate from the global economy for the past several decades in the name of economic efficiency. Globalization is all about saying, just a crude example, if you can grow corn in Iowa cheaper than anywhere else, then you should grow all of your corn in Iowa and nothing in Iowa except corn. It makes for a more efficient economy, but a less resilient economy, because if the corn crop in Iowa fails, then Iowa has nothing and nobody has any corn. Right? So a resilient economy is going to be a more localized economy and a more diversified economy. Exactly what we had 50 to 100 years ago. We also need to think about getting off of GDP as a measure of economic health. Right now, it is essentially our main measure. We do talk about unemployment and a few other things, but really, when you come right down to it, is the economy growing or not? What do the GDP numbers look like? Well, GDP is it's a perverse indicator. The numbers can go up during time of war, or if there's a natural disaster and we have to rebuild a whole bunch of infrastructure, that can make the GDP go up. So do we want more wars and natural disasters? No, of course not. We want more of what makes life enjoyable and secure and happy. Well, why don't we measure those things instead of measuring GDP? We could probably have a way of life that's much more satisfying, even as we consumed less. But we're only going to get there if we start paying attention to those factors that make life more satisfying. Getting off growth is probably going to also require worker ownership. Why that? Because our current corporate structure, where most of our big corporations sell their shares on Wall Street, basically requires growth. If you don't have growth this quarter, then you've got a problem, and your stock shares start to go down, and the CEO gets booted out, and all sorts of things happen. Well, if you have a family-owned business or a worker-owned business, as long as everyone's getting paid and you're producing a good product that people want to buy, everything's fine. It doesn't have to constantly grow and grow and grow. Well, we need more of those kinds of businesses. We need to talk about population stabilization and even population reduction on a global basis. I'm not talking about, taking every 10th person out and getting rid of them. I'm talking about family planning. We know how to do this. We've been taking funding away from family planning. We should be giving more funding to it. Now, the answer for our energy and climate problems, obviously, is to move away from fossil fuels. These are finite energy sources, and burning them changes the climate. So it's a no-brainer. But we're not going to be able to just unplug the coal power plant and plug in a solar panel and go on living exactly the way we were. Our current structures and infrastructures for using energy were designed around fossil fuels, including the aircraft and airline industries and road building industries and all the rest. So we have to rethink transportation around electricity. Electric trains, primarily. We're not going to have electric airliners. It just doesn't work, believe me. We could have small electric-powered aircraft, drones, or 2 or 3 seaters, but certainly not big Boeing aircraft that carry 200 or 300 people around at a time. The way our buildings work, the way our food system works, all of these were designed around cheap fossil fuels, but we're going to have to rethink them in an age of less energy and renewable energy. Economics itself is a discipline that grew up during this last 100 years. And economists have internalized a lot of ideas about the world that are actually pretty unrealistic. Economists actually believe that the environment is a subset of the economy. It's just a pool of resources that we extract in order to produce goods that then become waste, which goes away, wherever away is. In fact, the economy is a subset of the ecosystem. Always has been, always will be. We have to think of it that way. We should be thinking about the economy in terms of how can we make the economy mimic a healthy ecosystem. Obviously, growth in population and consumption levels is not sustainable. We can do it for a while. We've been doing it for a few decades. But you can't do it forever, so we should be thinking about what is the optimum level of population and consumption given Earth's finite resources. Do we think about that in Sonoma County? Do we think about what would be the optimum population of Sonoma County? No, we just think, well, we got to grow. Renewable resources have to be harvested at less than the rate of natural replenishment. For the average 7-year-old, this is not a difficult concept. For a PhD economist, it takes a while, but it's comprehensible. Non-renewable resources have to be recycled wherever possible, and in every case, their consumption has to decline. The rate at which we extract them from the Earth's crust has to decline. What are we trying to do right now? Increase our rate of extraction of all non-renewable resources. How much sense does that make? What does that leave for future generations? Ever and ever less. Okay. So can you follow all of those rules, those basic economic rules, and still make one of these? I don't know. I mean, the way we make them now violates virtually every one of those rules. We make these from rare, non-renewable resources with lots of fossil fuel transportation all over the place and virtually slave labor on the other side of the planet. Now, can you make these from renewable resources using local, well-paid labor? I don't know, but somebody should try. Now, there are a lot of things that we still have in abundance and that you can't deplete, in fact. Things like cooperation, intergenerational solidarity, satisfaction from honest work well done. These are the things that actually make life satisfying. So shouldn't we be concentrating on these things, finding ways to maximize these things while we reduce what can't continue, which is consumption? There are organizations that are trying to help jumpstart this kind of thing. One of them is transition towns. These were pioneered in Britain, in the United Kingdom, but they're all over the place now. There are over, I think, 120 or 150 transition towns here in the United States. These are places, or these are efforts, I should say, that are not led by government. It's not about waiting for the city council or the state government or the federal government to finally get it together and come up with policies and laws and so on. It's about getting together as neighbors and seeing what we can do with what we have right now. Sharing garden veggies, rebuilding our food system literally from the ground up. Sharing tools, tool libraries. Right here in Santa Rosa, we have a tool library. How many people knew about that? Yeah, it's a pretty cool thing. So you can just go downtown, Santa Rosa, and check out a tool the way you would check out a book at the library. So instead of going to Home Depot and buying a leaf blower or whatever it is that you're going to use 3 times a year and leave in your shed the rest of the time, just borrow it. That's the kind of thinking that goes on in transition towns. Now, I'm going to end by suggesting that overall, this economic transition that we've been talking about for the last hour is a very big deal. We've gotten ourselves out on the end of a very long ecological and thin ecological limb, and it's starting to shudder. It's certainly not the end of the world. Human beings are going to be around at the end of this century. The question is, what's it going to be like? Is it going to be hell on earth, or is it going to be, a new kind of happy existence with people consuming less but enjoying it more? Well, that's essentially up to those of us who are around today, the kinds of thinking that we do, policies that are enacted, citizen efforts that are undertaken. From a big picture perspective, I think this could be as important a transformation as any that we've undergone as a species, going back hundreds of thousands of years. Fire, that was a big thing. Language, several tens of thousands of years ago, when we first learned how to use abstract signs and symbols in order to coordinate our behavior over space and time. That enabled us, just as fire did, it enabled us to gain more control over our environment, right? Same thing with agriculture 10,000 years ago. That enabled us to extract more energy from our environment, to grow more food, to create more carrying capacity for more human beings. These have been great successes in our history as a species. Then the fossil fuel revolution increased our ability to control the environment and to create carrying capacity for more human beings. Well, we've kind of reached the end of that trajectory, haven't we? I mean, in science fiction, from here we go to the stars, right? We all get in spaceships and then start colonizing other planets. Well, it kind of hasn't happened, has it? We were supposed to have permanent bases on the moon and Mars by now. Remember the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey? Well, we're way beyond 2001 right now. That was a dozen years ago, and yet we don't have permanent bases on Mars. And the reason why? It takes so much energy to do that. It's probably not going to happen, at least not for millions and billions of humans. We've got to learn how to live on this planet, and that's what the next great transition is going to be about. We're at the leading edge of that transition right now, and it's going to be as important as anything that's ever happened previously in human history. It's a scary time to be alive, right? But it's also an incredibly exciting time to be alive, because it will be ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, who will basically reinvent human life on Earth. How much more exciting can you get? Thank you very much.